A great terrestrial fly, the Chubby Chernobyl ant is a foam pattern that is fairly easy to tie. It floats well in turbulent water, even when a weighted nymph is dropped below it. It typically doesn't imitate any one specific insect. However, when tied in the appropriate colors and sizes, I have used this fly on numerous occasions to imitate specific hatches such as salmon flies or golden stones. Like always, a list of the materials I used in the video can be found in the description below. Start the fly by laying down a thread base that covers the entire shank of the hook. Stop your thread at the end of the shank, or where the hook begins to bend. This is the point where we will tie in the tail. Crystal flash is used for the tail. Most crystal flash comes with a zip tie in the middle of the hank. I like to cut the fibers instead of pulling them out of the zip tie. This results in a material that stays easy to store even after a lot of use. Cut about 10 to 12 fibers loose from the hank and lay them on top of the hook, with the tips ending about halfway up the shank. Tie the crystal flash in by taking a couple of loose wraps so the fibers will stay on top of the hook. Once in place, take several tight wraps to anchor the ends of the fibers to the hook, then end with your thread back at the base of the tail. You can wait until you are done tying the fly to trim the tail, but I prefer to trim it now so it is out of the way.
The tail should be roughly 1/2 the shank of the hook.
Dubbing is used to create the entire underside of the body of this fly. Lots of different dubbings can be used for the body. A natural fiber might be used to imitate a specific insect, but in this video I am tying one of my favorite attractor patterns, so the original ice dub is being used. Take your dubbing and form a tight dubbing noodle, leaving just a little bare thread near the hook. To get a tight dubbing noodle, don't twist your fingers back and forth, only twist your fingers in one direction. Ice dub doesn't like to cling onto thread like some other finer dubbings do. With some practice, you can get a tight dubbing noodle by lightly wetting your fingers. However, if you are struggling, try putting some dubbing wax on your fingers that are forming the dubbing noodle. Once you have a tight dubbing noodle, begin wrapping that bare thread to the base of the tail so that the dubbing starts at that point, then form a small ball that ends even with the hook point. There are a few ways to form the body. My preferred method is to stamp the body out of a piece of foam using a tapered foam cutter. If cared for, foam cutters can last a long time and can add a considerable amount of efficiency and consistency to the bodies. Scissors can be used to form the body, however this is a skill I never mastered, and after tying a few dozen of these, I decided to invest in foam cutters instead. To use the foam cutter, place a piece of rubber under the foam to protect your table and the cutter. Place the open end of the cutter towards the side of the foam, leaving a small buffer of foam. Apply pressure while rocking back and forth several times. When you think the body is finished, don't pull the cutter out just yet. Flip the foam upside down and check that the entire cutter is visible. If any foam needs to be trimmed when you are done, it ruins the clean appearance created by the tapered cutter. The round tapered end is the butt of the fly and should extend a little beyond the bend of the hook. Place the foam on the fly, and once you are comfortable with the placement, take one tight wrap of thread to mark the tie-in point, and then temporarily remove the foam from the fly. Brush a small amount of superglue on top of the hook. Take the piece of foam and align our measured line with the hook point while hovering it over the hook. Once in place, press the foam onto the hook, securing it with your thread, gently pulling the thread tighter with each successive wrap. There are several materials that can be used to create the wing. I have used many of them over the years, and I have settled on Mcflylon as my preferred material. If you are using Mcflylon, cut 2 strands free from the hank. Even up the tips and measure them to be a little longer than the tail. With the fibers parallel to the hook, tie them in on top of the foam. Take several wraps to secure the fibers. Grab each clump of fibers and gently pull them apart. You can use a comb or a brush, but be careful not to pull fibers loose from the fly. Take the fibers from the forward-facing portion of the wing and fold a section of them towards the back and take a wrap in the gap you just created. Continue this process several times until all of the fibers are facing rearward. This process locks each group of fibers together at the base and adds a lot of durability to the fly. When all of the fibers are facing rearward, take a few wraps over the base to finish locking them in place. Another defining feature of this fly is how the legs are positioned. The legs are tied in on the sides of the body, so they will engage the surface of the water, giving the appearance of life. Silicone legs are often used to achieve this effect, though several different leg materials can be used. Separate 2 silicone legs from the rest and tie them in by wrapping each one around the thread. Slide them up, keeping them under the thread. This will hold them in place until you can take several wraps to secure them. Using the same technique as earlier, create a larger dubbing noodle and take several thread wraps to cover the tie-in points of the legs and the wing. Once covered, pull the foam body out of the way and continue wrapping the dubbing, stopping about 3/4 up the shank.
Secure the foam while stretching it gently. Tie in a second wing so that the ends of both wings are even with each other. Attach another set of legs, one on either side of the fly.
Create one more dubbing noodle to cover this final tie-in point and to create a head under the foam. While creating the head, be sure to leave space between the head and the eye of the hook. Whip finish and cut the thread from the hook. The fly is not quite finished, however, as now we need to trim and shape several parts. The foam is cut 3 times to create the head profile. The first is a 90-degree cut made a couple of eye lengths in front of the eye of the hook. 2 45-degree cuts are made to create a rounder profile. These do not need to be perfect, and be careful not to cut too much off. It can be really easy at this step to keep trimming back until you don't have a head anymore. If you are having issues cutting too much off, try taking smaller cuts and making more than 3 cuts as you see me do here. The tail should be trimmed a little longer than the foam body. If you haven't already, cut the tail to length.
The wings should be cut roughly even with the end of the tail.
Gently pull both wings back, and while holding them tight, make 1 cut from the top to the bottom. You can cut the wings straight, however I like the more natural appearance of a slightly curved wing. Next, trim the legs to be even. These can be a little tricky, but I find it best to turn the fly upside down if you have a rotary vise. Then you can grab all 8 legs at the same time and pull them up. The trick here is to not stretch any of the legs as you position them up. Cutting the legs too short removes a lot of the lifelike movement the legs have when they engage the surface of the water. However, leaving them too long results in legs that don't engage the water well and instead droop below the surface. Aim for that happy medium of wiggly legs that don't droop down. At this point, the fly is finished. When tied correctly, this fly is built like a tank, and it has hooked a lot of fish for me over the years. Sometimes you may find that the fly lands on its side on the water. If this happens to you, consider using a heavier hook to help it land with the correct orientation. Please feel free to ask any questions down below. I try my best to respond to all of them. Thanks for watching, and tie lines.